heart rate zone training and VO2, does it really matter? Does it matter if we count calories? Do we really need to be focused on training at VO2? These are some really great interactions and questions that I've gotten over the last week from my athletes and even strangers on the internet. So I want to give you guys a breakdown of my thoughts on these things. Now, as always, I'm going to give you what I know or have read through the research, but I'm also going to give you some observational insight and things that I've seen in my actual practice. And then I'm going to give you some opinion also. Now, most of the time, this is how all of my podcasts are typically structured, but I want to make this absolutely clear here. If you have read something contrary to what I'm talking about, if you have a different opinion or you've seen something different in practice, please feel free to share in the comments and let's have a conversation about it. I am always agreeable to discussion and I'm always open to having my mind changed. All right, let's start with the first one. So does heart rate zone training or does paying attention to your heart rate zones actually matter? Does what your Garmin say about your heart rate zones or whatever other fitness device you're using, is that really reliable? Why do we check heart rate zones or why do we train for heart rate zones? A lot of you guys probably have some type of fitness device. Garmin is one that's really popular and that most people tend to wear that shows you your different training zones, zone 1 all the way through zone 5. Zone 2 training is a big topic right now, and so there's this emphasis to do a lot of zone 2 training in order to improve your aerobic fitness, your cardiorespiratory fitness, and by default, your VO2. I get a lot of athletes and a lot of people in my DMs who talk about how inaccurate they feel like their heart rate zones are. And so the prevailing thought process is that heart rate zones are meaningless and there's really no reason to do heart rate zone training. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are die-hard heart rate zone training. I must be in my zone type of people. So is heart rate zone training appropriate? Is it accurate? Is it even worth paying attention to? And I would say, yes, it is. In the same way that we would track calories or macronutrients, heart rate zones can provide guidance and also provide insight into where we currently are in our training. So I'll give you an example of this. At the lab, we bring athletes in, we test their VO2, we establish their heart rate training zones. The way that we establish heart rate training zones in someone who is considered trained or an experienced athlete is we actually use a percentage of their VO2 max to determine their heart rate zones. When you're working with devices such as Garmin or even online calculators, what they're often going to use is age-related heart rate data. So it's often going to be 220 minus your age is really common. There's some heart rate reserve techniques as well that can be used to estimate. For most trained people, this isn't really going to be accurate. And so if you're utilizing a fitness tracker and it's giving you heart rate data, it's typically using a calculation that's based on norms. When we do actual direct testing by gas exchange, we are looking at your VO2, how much oxygen you're actually consuming at a specific heart rate. And in our particular situation, we are also measuring CO2. So we can look at substrate utilization during training, and this is going to tell us a lot about where you are in your training zones. And so we can watch your respiratory data and determine where your aerobic threshold, your anaerobic threshold, your AT1, AT2, VT1, VT2, whatever you want to call it, we can determine where that actually is by direct measurement on the day that you come in and do the test. And so this provides much more accurate data. The Garmin is going to use age-related norms, and then as you collect data points, it may tend to trend towards more accurate the more data points you have. It is definitely going to be the least accurate when you first get it and start wearing it. In a 2024 study or review looking at wearables and accuracy, on average, most of your fitness wearables are going to overestimate your VO2 max by about 15%. Now, when we're in the lab and we're looking at your VO2, we are actually looking at your VO2 in real time, assuming that we've calibrated everything correctly, assuming that the mask is fitting you properly. And we can actually look to see where that VO2 starts to plateau. And we can get you within a respectable range of your max. And so a lot of people are surprised when their zone 2 heart rate in beats per minute tends to be higher when we test it through VO2 versus when we're just relying on the age calculations to determine where your heart rate zones should be. The other thing that the direct testing allows me to do is it really tells a story about what you've been doing with your training for quite some time. It will tell me your current fitness level, not just based on VO2, but how you actually perform in each zone. Are we being really efficient with fat utilization during our lower aerobic zones? How efficiently are we using carbohydrates in our higher zones? Where is that threshold where you're hitting that point where your carbohydrate utilization is going to start to take off? And what does your recovery look like when we stop the test? How is your heart rate trending? And so there's a lot of things that I can assume about you, even if I know nothing at all about you, about your fitness level, about your nutrition, and about your training program. And this data can actually provide insight on how to move the needle forward for you, rather than just kind of using a guess method where this is what the research says, this is what most training programs do, and so I'm going to just do this and hope that I get better. Checking your VO2, looking at your heart rate zone data is something that we use to simply look at how you're progressing and where you currently are in that moment in time. And so it can be useful data. Now, your heart rate can vary for different reasons. You know, if you've had more caffeine than normal before you train, if you've been under a lot of stress lately, as temperatures change, so especially here in the South, when we go from more of the temperate winter climate to more of the hotter summer, you're going to see somewhere between a 7 to 10% decrease in your performance simply just because the temperature has changed. So that's something that we want to keep in mind, and that can also drive up your heart rate. Some of the trends we would want to see in heart rate data would be if you are training and we see that your heart rate is lowering in each zone at the same paces, and or you're getting faster in each zone and your heart rate is staying relatively the same or possibly dropping. One interesting thing when I look at the data is that I can tell a lot of times how you spend most of your time training. People who do a significant amount of zone 2 training typically have a very large heart rate range spread in their zone 2 or in their aerobic zones. And I've actually seen as high as a 20 beat range and even a 30 beat range in zone 2. On the other hand, people who don't do a lot of zone 2 training, their trend in zone 2 or their range tends to be smaller. And as I'm looking at their respiratory quotient, which is their carbon dioxide, oxygen, which is their oxygen consumption versus their carbon dioxide blow off, they tend to be less efficient at using fat as a fuel source in those lower aerobic zones and tend to go right towards carbohydrate utilization regardless of what intensity they're training at. And their spread in zone 3 or zone 4 might actually be a little bit wider if they tend to train predominantly in those areas. So again, when we look at heart rate training and VO2, yes, the zones do matter. Testing it matters. There are going to be days where your zone 2 might feel like it's more effort than others. So there are other things we want to take into consideration. Your heart rate zones should not be the absolute when it comes to training. We also want to take into consideration RPE What does our effort level feel like? This is especially important if you work in the tactical space and you deal with sleep disruptions, high levels of stress. There may be days where your zone 2 feels like an RPE of 7 or 8. When it comes to calorie counting, a really interesting question came up recently, and I'm going to read it off to you guys. And this came from one of my coaching clients in our weekly group chat in the program. This is why I love running a program that is chat based, is because anytime you have a random thought in your head, you can just send it. Why do people say a pound of fat is 3,500 calories? There are 454 grams in a pound. 454 times 9 is over 4,000. This is a really good question. And honestly, I've probably only had to answer this question like 3 times in my career because people just don't think about this. So, when we look at grams of nutrition versus grams by weight, the measurement that we're using is exactly the same. But the reason that 454 grams by weight, when we're talking specifically about fat, is not 4,000 calories is because only about 85% of a fat molecule actually fat. The rest of it is just water. Remember that our cells, all of our cells, contain a significant amount of water, and fat is no exception. And so when we're calculating out how many calories per gram of fat, we're only calculating out about 85% of the actual total because we are not going to count water in there. Water is a macronutrient, but it does not have a calorie amount attached to it. This kind of segues into, should we be counting calories? Should we be counting macros? Because if it's not accurate, what is the point of doing it? The same as when we look at blood pressure, heart rate data, VO2, is we are always wanting to assess trends. We need a metric to gauge our progress through. We need a metric that we can use that's relatively reliable and relatively repeatable. So I like to put it this way, and we'll look at it from 2 different perspectives. So we'll look at it from weight loss, and then we'll also look at it from the perspective of low energy availability or under fueling. In a lot of the clients that I work with that are struggling to lose weight, knowing how much food to eat as an appropriate serving amount versus some of the psychological issues around food that they're dealing with can be confusing. When we talk about weight, especially being overweight or overfat or obese, a lot of the things that go on around that are psychological. And sometimes there have to be left and right limits. There has to be structure. There has to be some type of boundary in order for us to learn how food can best serve us. Even though not every apple you eat has the same 100 calories, even though not every starch you eat has exactly 4 calories per gram, not every protein you eat has exactly 4 calories per gram. There's a lot of variance. When we're counting macros and even calories, typically what we're doing is rounding. Also, a lot of the information we have about food related to macronutrients and calories is based on laboratory measurements that we know don't necessarily equate perfectly to how the body actually metabolizes food. But we still need a tracking mechanism if we want to make changes. For someone who is over fat or obese or just wants to get into a calorie deficit, having those left and right limits, understanding what the boundaries are, can make progress more consistent towards their weight loss goal. For somebody who is at risk for overtraining, overreaching, or underfueling, knowing a minimum of food to have can be really important. A good example of this is when I'm working with high performing athletes, what a common theme is low carbohydrate intake, too low carbohydrate intake, and often too low calorie intake. Because sometimes we're struggling with aesthetics, sometimes we're struggling with just cultural norms of not eating. And we need to be able to give individuals who do have more of that high performing personality hard numbers to work off of, even though they understand that there is a lot of variance in what's actually contained in their food. They still need to have those numbers to help them avoid under fueling and help them to understand that it's okay to eat higher calorie, it's okay to eat higher carbohydrate based on X, Y, and Z training program, and your aesthetics are going to stay relatively the same. And so none of this stuff is 100% accurate ever, even when we do the laboratory testing environment. But we need metrics to work off of. We need metrics to be able to assess where we are at any given point in time with our programming. The third question that came up was actually on a Reddit thread. And so I was having a conversation with someone about how to increase their VO2. So I'm going to bring it back a little bit. We don't ever train to increase VO2. Just like I said a minute ago, VO2 should be treated just as a metric, a snapshot of where we are in time. And then we trend that over time to help inform what's going on with our metabolic system, with our cardiorespiratory fitness. We want to train for the outcome that we're wanting. What is it? We want to be able to run 2 miles in under 15 minutes. We want to be able to do a marathon, a half marathon. We want to be able to run the fastest mile we've ever ran in our lives, whatever the case may be. We want to train the fitness outcome. VO2 is just the metric that we use to gauge how successful we are being or not being. There is going to be a certain point where your VO2 is going to increase much more slowly. So as you're new to training, just like any other newbie gains that you're going to get, your VO2 is going to increase substantially when you first start training that fitness parameter. As you start to get closer to your potential, you're going to see much smaller percentage increases over time. And then there may be a limit to where your VO2 hits. This was kind of the issue with the gentleman I was talking to on Reddit, is that his VO2 had plateaued. We have to ask deeper questions. What are you currently doing for training? Just doing zone 2 training is not going to increase your VO2, or there is going to come a certain point where it will no longer give you those changes in your VO2 or your training outcomes that you are anticipating seeing. So we have to switch from that endurance training focus into more of like a power speed focus where we're training past threshold, maybe a little bit more frequently. And once we've kind of optimized there, then we come back down and we refocus on an endurance plan before we go back up into power and speed. Everything is cyclic, okay? So once we've pushed the envelope in one phase, then we need to move on to the next phase to be able to continue improving and growing. Just keep in mind that there is some genetics behind VO2. And so even with all the training in the world, sometimes you're gonna see these really high performing athletes with a VO2 lower than what you would expect. There is no standard for VO2. We have normative data of what we would expect your VO2 to be based on your age, your gender, your training history, your occupation even. So if you're a firefighter, if you're a military service member, if you're special operations, there are certain VO2 numbers that we would anticipate you need to be at. But again, just like heart rate zone training, it is not absolute. It's simply just a metric. All right, so again, if you have any thoughts, opinions, arguments you want to make, I'm always open to them, and I want you to drop them in the comments below. And if you're curious about getting VO2 testing done, there are lots of different places that you can go. It's so much more readily accessible now than it has been in the past. So you can just get on the Google machine and look up VO2 test near me. You can also come and see me if you are in the Columbus, Fort Benning area, and I would be happy to conduct your test for you.